Hello, good morning. Hope everybody's well rested because today is the day for the big picture. Today's the day when we're going to try to tie together the proceedings of the past 2 days. We've heard challenges and warnings. We've digested facts and evidence. We've talked about tools, political, technological. And today we want to do the hard work of trying to talk about turning aspirations into action. And because it's a slightly complicated route that we're going to be traveling, I want to start out by giving you a roadmap. We'll begin with reviewing some of the highlights and key messages that came out of both the ministerial industry sessions yesterday and the session of ministers alone. We will then ask two representatives of leading international institutions to tell us what their organizations can do to translate those key messages and highlights into action. Then we're going to have a short break. And after that, we want to hear from you, from the international stakeholders in the transport system. We have 5 international bodies, institutions, which we're going to be asking to come up on stage and discuss with us. But we'd also like to tap into the incredible reservoir of expertise that we have here in the audience. So we will be opening the session up to questions and statements at the end. So that's our roadmap for the morning. And now I'd like to start out by asking our 3 rapporteurs from yesterday's panels to please join us on the stage. And Claude Mandil is going to begin by telling us a summary of the highlights and keynotes of yesterday's session on prospects for an energy-efficient and low-carbon future.
Thank you very much, ministers, dear colleagues. The first session yesterday, I think, to my own surprise, was very much consensual. There was a lot of agreement among panelists, and not least the first point of agreement was that the challenge we face is absolutely huge and that we cannot wait anymore. We cannot wait for long-term solutions. We have to start finding solutions and implementing solutions right now for a simple reason, which is that each and every day in the world, we emit 70 million tons of CO2 each day. And there was an agreement too that the challenge is threefold. That means that we have at the same time to care about economic growth, energy security, and environment protection. Of course, it is particularly challenging for the transport sector, because the transport sector is still now so much linked to oil, with the particular problems linked to oil. If we bring together those preliminary, the challenge is huge. We have to work immediately, and it's particularly challenging for oil. That means that certainly the first and main tool is more energy efficiency. And that was really clearly stated by all panelists yesterday. Some said even we have been so far working too much on supply, we have to work more on demand. And of course, that means too more technology in the future, and that means more investment, that has been said too. The good news for the governments, perhaps, is that they are needed. Ministers, you are needed. Your government involvement is needed, and that has been said very clearly by the industry yesterday in the panel. Government involvement is needed first, of course, to contribute to financing research and development, which is badly needed, because in the long term we will need technology breakthroughs. Government involvement is needed to organize the market, not to substitute to the market, but to organize the market in order to let market forces play their role. Government involvement is needed to regulate when and where market forces cannot play their role because market is not perfect. And government involvement is needed to incentivize. We need sticks, but also we need carrots. That has been said by several panelists. There are some requirements for government involvement which have been highlighted. It should be stable. Please do not change the rules every day or even every year. The approach should be integrated. That means including all the steps of the value chain. It should be, if possible, global, worldwide. But at the same time, we had, during the debate, a very strong warning, and very appropriate, in my view, warning of Ivo de Boer. Global, yes, but does not take it as an excuse to postpone any decision. If it cannot be immediately global, let it start in a sub-global way. And in particular, of course, there is a specific responsibility for the European Union. And I think that many people, including myself, have been struck to learn during the panel that there is still nothing such as a European sky, and which makes consumption of kerosene 10% higher than it could be. That has been said yesterday. It is a striking information, a striking number. Now let me finish with a few remarks, some of them picked from the panel and some of them I recognize more of my own. First, it has been said, we don't need more new targets. We have enough targets, at least in the European Union. My own view is perhaps we have too many. But what we deeply need is implementation. It's not enough to give targets if you do not know how to reach the target. We need implementation. We need policies and measures to implement, to be implemented in order to reach the target. There was, to my view, a very interesting point made by one of the panelists, specialists in scenarios, who was saying that the cooperation scenarios are always better than the so-called scramble scenarios. In this domain, better to cooperate than to fight against each other. And the last point, the general view in the panel was that high prices of energy, and in particular high prices of oil, are helpful. And that's true. They are very helpful in order to incentivize energy efficiency and to incentivize alternatives to oil. At the same time, maybe it's my own view, we have to keep in mind two things. That the first one is that it's good for us who are generally in developed and rich countries. It can be a tragedy for the poorest countries. And the second point is that even if I personally have no doubt that the long-term trend is to high prices of energy, we should not exclude that in a shorter term there could be up and downs, and including some downs in the coming months for oil, just because the market will starts to realize that these high prices are killing some demand. So that means that governments should be prepared to keep the momentum of more energy efficiency, more renewables, more nuclear, more alternatives, whatever the alternatives, even with more moderate prices. Another tragedy would be that with prices lower than they are today, would give a signal of stopping all our efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's talk a bit more about the issue of prices. We heard a very impassioned plea yesterday from Minister Erlings during that panel not to raise energy taxes and then use them as a covert means, use the revenues as a covert means of funding other things. But I'm wondering whether we don't potentially have the opposite problem at the moment. We're seeing in the face of higher prices, governments in various countries talking about lowering and suspending energy taxes. Do we have the political will to stay with the tax systems that we have in the face of $150 a barrel oil?
That's a very good question, and you did not mention the countries, but certainly my own country, France, is one of them, on those where this issue is being discussed.
My own presidential candidates are also some of them.
Okay. Well, my personal point of view is that really it is the thing not to be done, for a number of reasons. First, market signals are important. When prices are high, the market signal is, dear consumers, it's time for you to save energy. It's time to consume less. If you shield the consumer from the market signals, the result will be certainly the opposite of what is needed, that is an increase in energy consumption, or at least not a decrease in energy consumption. So, very bad signal to the consumers. Second, very bad signal to the producers too. What do we say if we lower the taxes when prices get higher? We say to the producers, dear producers, don't worry. Don't worry, please continue to produce less than expected and even more to invest less than expected. Prices will go up, but your clients will not see the results. We protect your market, so please continue to do what you are doing. Very bad signal too. And of course, policymakers tell me, yes, but you have a stone heart. You do not see how painful it is for the poorest people who have to pay more and who cannot pay. Well, my answer there is that lowering taxes on gasoline and oil products just means subsidizing not the poor, but the rich, because you subsidize those who consume the more. And who are those who consume the more? They are the richer, those who have the bigger cars. So I don't disagree that there is a problem for the low-income categories in our countries, even more, as I said, in other countries, but I think that should be addressed by other means than lowering the taxes and the price of gasoline.
Claude Mandil, thank you very much. I'd like to move on now to Julia King. She is a former Director of Engineering at Rolls-Royce and now the Vice-Chancellor at the UK's Aston University. Would you tell us the highlights, please, of your panel on introducing energy-efficient transport technologies?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. And it's good to see so many people here on the final day of a conference. I'm reporting insights from both a workshop on the first day and also the ministerial industry panel in the same area yesterday. And Claude started his insights by saying there was agreement in his panel that we needed solutions and we needed them right now. And I'm glad to say that from the technology groups, we came up with our very first conclusion was a strong, slightly guarded, but a strong, optimistic message that certainly in the area of cars, 30% reductions in CO2 emissions are available with improvements to conventional technologies and at low cost, i.e. it's a cost that would be good value for the consumer and within 10 years. But there's a caution on that. The historic trend has been that improvements in efficiency have been eaten up by creep in the power levels of our vehicles and indeed the features we have in our vehicles. So we have to stop that from happening if we're to translate these benefits into reduced CO2. And furthermore, 50% reductions at reasonable cost levels were readily conceivable for the longer term. There was general agreement about a technology roadmap, which is to start with a lot of improvements still available for the internal combustion engine-based system, moving probably to a plug-in hybrids, which might grow significantly from 2020 onwards, and potentially to electric vehicles beyond 2030, but also still quite a number of people enthusiastic about hydrogen as a fuel. And if you're looking that far into the future, it's good to have options. So I think we should be pleased that there is still more than one technology being discussed for that sort of timescale. There were a number of estimates of the vehicle costs. At the 30% improvement level, the high end of the cost estimates were 2,000 to 3,000 euros a vehicle, but there were a number of estimates that were well below that. And that's at current technology cost levels. That doesn't really take into account the fact that we're talking here about an automotive industry which has a fantastic track record in cost reduction. Indeed, the costs for 50% improvement were around double that level, but again, not taking into account the opportunities for cost reduction that the industry delivers so well. And I think a message from that is that in many of the economic analyses we see, such as indeed Nick Stern's analysis and the more recent Vattenfall analysis, suggests that the costs for automotive are on the high side. I think we should relook at that, because I think, particularly in the context of oil prices and the way they're going, these actually do not look particularly high. These look really as if they should be quite cost-effective. An important point, I think, that some of the new technologies, and we're talking about potentially quite a lot, mean we really do need to rethink the standard drive cycles, and we should make this a priority. One of the exciting technologies is the quite simple concept of stop-start, and for urban driving, we heard figures of up to 25% reduction in fuel consumptions and CO2 emissions, but that doesn't come through particularly strongly in the standard drive cycles. So I think it's time to also move on that reassessment. With having said so much about these are cost-effective, you might say, well, what's the role then for our legislators? And again, as Claude has mentioned, we need legislation and regulation, because the market here is not perfect. And particularly, we as consumers suffer from myopia in terms of our future savings and indeed where we think the future oil price may go. So we heavily discount future savings and are not prepared to pay more upfront for our cars. So industry feels it needs a level playing field, and we as consumers don't behave in logical ways. So that does make intervention necessary if we want to get these savings soon. I think there was strong agreement that a progressive fuel economy standard is seen as a key requirement in attaining these reductions, and also in providing the stability in the environment that Claude also refers to. So both soon we need some agreement on the levels, and I hope we'll be able to agree for 2012, but also we need to give industry a view into the future. There are other sorts of taxes that were seen as being good, for example, the car ownership, annual ownership taxes, things like vehicle excise duty in the United States, but I think in the United Kingdom, but I think those of us in the UK, and particularly our government, might want to warn people that that's not entirely popular. The underpinning some of these longer-term developments is, of course, an issue about the CO2 emissions from our power generation. And the low-carbon technologies based on batteries or hydrogen require low-carbon power generation. The automotive industry can't be expected to be responsible for making that happen, but it needs signals from government to know that government will take that on board so that we really can deliver the benefits from electric vehicle systems. And that's one, because of the timescales in power generation, that's one we really do have to make sure we are dealing with right now. I should say we did talk a lot about cars, but of course other modes are important. Oh, I'm terribly sorry, I'm forgetting to change the slides for you. Other modes are important, and in air, rail and shipping, where we have much longer equipment life cycles, there are still significant short-term improvements to be obtained. In fact, we talked about a number of improvements coming from operations and infrastructure, and Claude has already mentioned the 10% reduction in kerosene potential from European skies, and we heard the rail industry talking about the same sort of common regulations and driving licenses on the European railways, on cross-border issues for the European railways. So I think there are some issues there that we would urge governments to take on board and deal with quickly. I'd just finally like to say a few words about research. We obviously were talking a lot about new technologies, and research there is key. I think as we looked across all the different modes, there were some propulsion technologies which were potentially deployable across all modes. We heard, for example, about fuel cells as aircraft auxiliary power units, and right up in a completely different size scale to ship propulsion units up at sort of 25, 30 megawatt levels even potentially. And I think public research funding should reflect this potential for expanding some of these technologies right across a whole range of transport sectors. We heard a lot about the need for new battery research and technology development, and clearly energy storage and potentially batteries, energy storage is going to be very key in many of these areas. We also heard from Claude about this being a global problem, but we have to start in our own backyard. And I think there was a very strong message that we as the OECD countries must take a lead, but we must also bring along and work with our colleagues in developing countries. And one of the areas where we can do this, I think, is technology collaborations with developing countries. And it would be good to see more R&D funding going into, for example, collaborations with India and China, not only on low-cost vehicles, but on low-cost, low-carbon vehicles to address their very rapidly growing market for vehicles. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pick up first on the question of intervention. We've heard talk in all the panels of a whole basket of policy tools and measures. If you had to pick just one, where would you put your money?
Can I cheat and pick two? my very first one would have to be the vehicle efficiency regulation. I think there was a very strong message. We can do something quickly on this area of demand management, and as Claude has emphasized, that's a really key area. So vehicle efficiency regulation, I would like to see us have agreed standards in Europe for 2012, but also, as has been done for the diesel emissions, industry needs to see what the pathway into the future is in order for it to make the appropriate R&D investments. But if I may have a second one, which is very much a personal passion, we've talked a lot about the R&D needed actually in the auto sector, but I know it's needed in other sectors as well, and it's needed in the power sector for clean energy. But if you look at the International Energy Agency data for how our governments spend their public R&D funds, if you take out military and nuclear, then you find that developed countries are spending only 1% to 3% of public R&D on low-carbon energy technologies. This is a huge and urgent problem. We heard yesterday from many politicians saying politicians needed to be brave, and I want to meet the brave politician who is prepared to spend between 25% and 40% of public R&D on the most urgent global problem that we have.
But Julia, don't we see in the biofuel disappointment perhaps the potential risk of governments throwing too much money at a fashionable new technology too soon?
Let me say that perhaps I think that's a little unfair. I think we need to recognize that in many areas biofuels started not as a CO2 reduction, but actually as a route to energy security and away from oil provided by the Arabs. And it's also been seen as a way of strengthening the farming industry as well. So I think biofuels is a very complex area. But I would say we have an urgent problem. research is about taking risks. So we do need to recognise research isn't always going to work. If we're going to get the best research, we're going to have to follow up exciting ideas, some of which will work and some of which won't. But I think we need more funding, and for the longer term, we need to recognise that we should be supporting a range of areas, which is why, for the long-term future, I think we need to be supporting both, for example, hydrogen vehicle developments and battery vehicle developments. It's better to have at least two solutions rather than just one.
Julia King, thank you very much. May I just have the tool for the... Thank you. That's for you. So now we're going to hear a summary of key arguments raised by the panel on implementing integrated policies and planning. Werner Rothengatter is head of the Institute for Economic Policy Research at Germany's University of Karlsruhe.
Well, thank you very much. Well, we have discussed at length policies which could be implemented already in the next years to come to reduce CO2. And in yesterday's panel, the chairman, Minister Leuenberger, started with a very simple question: is it possible at all to influence the development of transport by political means? And it was then the discussion, what is a basic needs for mobility, for instance, or for logistic services, which is autonomously developing, and how the state can influence this path of development. And the first conclusion was that, in particular, the Swiss transport policy is very active with influencing the development of transport. They are imposing strict rules on trucking. They are imposing the highest fees, the highest tolls of the world for trucking in Switzerland. And the result of the discussion was that there also can be an overkill of public instruments insofar as isolated application of instruments then can lead to undesired diversions of traffic. Like in Switzerland, if you price the Gotthard tunnel very high, then the trucks will divert to the Brenner, where the path is much cheaper. It is longer. That means a longer distance has to be traveled. The CO2 production is higher, such that this isolated policy, helps Switzerland to reduce CO2 and also other indicators of environmental pollution, but it doesn't help the world. So we have to be very careful with these measures which can be taken by the state. They have to be harmonized. This is the first message. Of course, mobility and goods transport are not driven by the state, they are driven by the markets. But the state has the power to influence the form of mobility. It can influence the length of trips, and it can influence the mode which is chosen. The third message is that market-conforming instruments are preferable to strict regulations. There's always the consideration that the state should impose strict regulations, car bans, for instance, or truck bans, or sectoral truck bans, as it is tried in Tyrol in Austria. It has been shown in the past that in this case, always undesired reactions of the market follow. So as soon as you impose pure and strict regulations, you have to be aware of undesired reactions of the market. And these undesired reactions can cause counterproductive developments. Pricing instruments are very flexible. So these instruments have been discussed at length, but we also came to the conclusion that pricing instruments have to be carefully designed. They have to be complete to work. So all partial pricing instruments, cordon pricing for cities, for instance, or also partial instruments only applied for motorways, have side reactions which might come out negative, such that the overall effect is very low, if there's a positive effect at all. And pricing instruments are only accepted if the revenues are reinvested. And this is a big problem in policy, because usually the Minister of Transport is responsible for the pricing strategies, and the Minister of Finance is responsible for the spending of the money, and the Minister of Finance always is happy if there are additional funds coming in, such that the general taxes can be raised if the special charges on transportation come in. This is a typical German problem, where indeed the funds which come in from motorway charging are spent on transport, but on the other hand, the Minister of Finance reduces the global budget for transport on the other side. So this is very important for acceptability of pricing system, that the users can be sure that the money which comes in is used indeed for investment in the same sector. Then influencing logistics seems to be very difficult at the first glance. So if you look at logistic patterns, they are highly individual, highly heterogeneous, and it appears that the individual firms are planning optimally, that there is no possibility to improve on these logistic patterns. And I give you an example for that, for a European pattern of logistic tours from Stuttgart to the UK. And the first what you see is that it is not so that the goods are carried directly from Stuttgart to London, but there's a consolidation point in Stuttgart, and the goods which are transported are coming from the region, okay, and are consolidated at the point where the tour starts. And you see that the departure of this, or the destination of this tour is also not one place, there are 3 destinations. And if you look at the retour, you see that it is different, that the retour is not the same way back. So the reloading is not done at the same place as the unloading, and the retour goes through Paris and then through Stuttgart, and in Paris there's a consolidation again. Parts of the goods are reloaded to another haulage company, and the other part goes to Stuttgart again, and a third part goes to Munich. So this is a very complex tour for a very easy logistic scheme. And this tour is very volatile. So as soon as the customers change their strategies a little bit, then also these tours will be different. Therefore, it's very difficult to influence the pattern of these logistic schedules. But as soon as you analyze 1,000 firms, you suddenly discover patterns. You discover patterns of flows on particular corridors which are bigger than others, and you see that consolidation is possible, and that also consolidation of this tour, which has been described in the first slide, can be consolidated with other tours. And as a result, also, the long-haul tours could be consolidated in a way that the railways or inland waterways or coastal shipping gets a higher chance. That means the involvement of environmentally more friendly modes is in principle possible as soon as the consolidation strategies change. And the outcome of the panel was that there is a substantial potential for the change of consolidation in European transport. Of course, these examples relate to Europe. That means in developing countries, in threshold countries like China, the structures are completely different. And also the possibility to employ inland waterways or to employ the railways is different. But nevertheless, the basic message is there is a high potential for changing the logistic patterns. And this was a little bit surprising, not expected at the beginning. Now, the basic messages with respect to logistics was that there are several ways to improve CO2 performance. First, the firm's internal benchmarking strategies are just coming up, and there's a high potential for that. One example was DHL. They have promised to reduce CO2 production in their company, including the supplies, by 30% until 2020. So it's a big challenge. Secondly, the state can set incentives through taxation subsidization schemes. An example is a top runner scheme in Japan, which can be considered also for other countries. That means the top runner gets a tax relief, and in some years, the top runner also is treated like the other players in the market, such that the adopter of the best technology always has a benefit. Thirdly, charges can be differentiated on the basis of CO2 production, differentiated according to Euro standards, for instance. And this is a challenge for the European Commission and also for the European Council to introduce a Euro 6 standard, including CO2. And this can create much incentives through an appropriate differentiation of charges on European motorways and primaries. Voluntary actions, as a message, should be an integral part of strategies. You cannot work against the market. You should use the market. And finally, cooperation of logistic players to consolidate consignments create a high future potential. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Briefly, if you would, please, because I know we're a bit over our time. To what extent are you seeing shifts in companies' logistic patterns purely in response to higher prices?
This can be seen in several companies, for instance, Walmart, or we mentioned the example of DHL. So suddenly CO2 savings has become a benchmark within the companies and a management strategy. That means managers are rewarded if they save CO2, if they present convincing concepts. And this is the main point, that the market works towards this goal, and that it is not so that the state sets rules against the market.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our rapporteurs for those very interesting summaries of the highlights of the panels. Well, as you know, we've had a critical mass of ministerial energy here over the past few days. Our hosts achieved the astonishing fact of getting together 51 ministers to focus on the challenge of climate change for the transport sector. And we're now going to hear about the highlights of their meetings to come up with aspirations for this. So I would like to ask the Finnish minister, Vehviläinen, to come to the podium and tell us about what the ministerial session came up with in terms of principles.
Honourable Forum participants, fellow ministers, Secretary General of the ITF, ladies and gentlemen. At first, I like to thank rapporteurs. Very interesting presentations. Thank you. It's a great pleasure for me as a president of the Forum to have the opportunity to present some of the findings and results of our ministerial discussion yesterday. We had over 30 ministers present for our discussion, and all the Forum members' countries were represented. We can be very satisfied with the level of the attendance. It shows that member countries find this an important event. We were very pleased to also have India as a special guest. We hope that we will now develop and improve contacts with India on this and other Forum topics. I would like to underline that this is the first time ever that the transport sector has discussed this topic on such a scale geographically and also covering all modes of transport. This is a very important step. Climate change is a complex topic, and the right mixture of policies is not yet known. So we really need to share ideas and discuss together. Our aim in setting up this forum was to create a high-level community on transport. And we have now started to do that. We have many key actors represented. And you all have a role to play too. We can see from everything we have heard here and from the material presented during the forum that the industry is working on this issue in a very active way. We ministers have the political responsibility, but we realise that we alone can only do so much. We need to have all the key actors involved, and your views all matter. I have therefore asked the Secretary General to bring together all the messages and ideas that have emerged here during these 3 days. Let me say a few words about the role of the ministers. We see our role in a number of ways. First, we have to give political leadership. We want to do this by sending clear messages to all the actors in the sector that we are determined to move to a low-carbon economy. This is of course a long-term objective, but we need to turn our policies, instruments and measures so that they are consistent with that aim. We are determined to provide the leadership and give signals that will help you as industry and consumers to make choices that will reduce our carbon footprint. Second, we have to be proactive with colleagues in other ministries. Many of the decisions that concern climate change are taken in different ministries. We have to be involved and follow them closely. We need to ensure that transport interests are taken into account. Third, we want to work with all actors. We want to send a message to the industry that we will support its efforts to make transport more fuel efficient and reduce carbon dependence. We want to set the goal of a low carbon economy as a vision. Of course, it is not attainable in the short term, but it sets a strong long-term objective. Now I want to share with you the highlights of the key messages from the ministerial session. First, we need a strategic approach which brings together the instruments on technology and on policy, and which is coherent at all levels and both within and across modes. Second, we need to take the short-term measures that are not so expensive, and several of these measures that have been identified, like eco-driving and better tyres. Third, we need to turn greater attention to new technologies and systems that can break our dependence on oil. This is absolutely needed, as the short-term measures alone are not enough. Fourth, many of our traditional policies help to reduce CO2 emissions. Congestion reduction policies, support of public transport, investments in environmentally friendly modes, many of these policies are already helping and just need to be strengthened. Fifth, we need to work on all levels of government. Finally, we want to send a clear message to global forums working on these issues, and we ask the International Maritime Organization, International Civil Aviation Organization and the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe to accelerate their work on this topic. Of course, there are still issues on which we have differing views. This is natural because countries are at different stages and have different circumstances. Some points of difference include whether specific targets for the sector are needed or useful, what is the most effective way to apply economic instruments, including emission trading, how best to make biofuels more sustainable. On these issues, we still need more research, analysis and discussion. The text of our key messages and the Presidency note accompanies it are being distributed to you all. The key messages are generally supported by countries and they are ready to implement them. We all know that we have an immense challenge ahead of us in the transport sector, but we are all committed to work towards our very ambitious goal, low carbon future for transport. I think this is a great step forward, and if countries follow up and implement the measures, it will make a big difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. As you heard, you will receive a copy of this when you go out at the coffee break. You will find copies at the door, so please help yourselves to those. I will just sum up perhaps one more time the gist of those messages. The transport sector clearly has a very important contribution to make. The ministers were unified on that point. They feel that a strategic approach is necessary. They affirm the role of technological change and research and development in regard to second-generation biofuels, but also in regard to facilitating market adoption of low-carbon technologies in general. They also stressed the role of targets. There was agreement certainly on that, though there is some difference of opinion as to whether the targets should be sectoral or economy-wide. So if you are a journalist, or perhaps a taxpayer, or a citizen, or all three, you're wondering, how do these aspirations get translated into concrete action? And to talk about that, we're going to invite two representatives of international organizations, Mark Belke, who is with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, and Marc Juel, who is with the World Bank, to join us on the stage and tell us a bit more. Mr. Belke, may I ask you to the podium, please? And Mr. Juel, if you would take a seat with me.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my dear friend Jack Short, Staatssecretary Van Randolph, representing the host country. I'd like to congratulate ITF, and particularly the ministers, for selecting the topic for this global conference. Transport after energy is the second most important source of CO2 emissions, and that is why the transport community has to take part of the responsibility for the issue. UN has launched war against global warming. What it means is that every activity that we pursue in the UN is geared towards the issue, and at the same time we try to streamline the global warming issues into development activities of the UN system. UNECE, United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, in Geneva, has been, within this larger framework, systematically addressing environmental issues at large, energy efficiency, and sustainability in transport. I will show you 3 slides. I don't know which buttons should I push. Okay. And the 3 slides are 3 messages. Well, within the UNECE, we have something which is called World Forum for Harmonization of Vehicle Regulation. And its main task is development of vehicle regulations and introduction of innovative vehicle technologies. We call it, in our lingo, Working Party 29, which suggests that there are at least 28 other important activities in the ECE. That's not true. We have many more. Since the World Forum became World Forum in 2000, a number of global technical regulations have been established under the 1998 Global Agreement. And this slide shows you the geographical spread of the contracting parties to this agreement. Well, quite a strong group of nations. The purpose of this agreement is to establish a global process for the worldwide harmonization of technical requirements regarding safety, environmental protection, energy efficiency, and anti-theft of motor vehicles and their trailers. This is the second slide. And it shows that we are not only global, almost global, but also quite efficient. It shows you how the regulations changed, how the emissions, different kinds of emissions of vehicles changed And by now, limits are 20 times lower or more than before. It shows you that we can be efficient. If we were efficient with pollutants, then maybe we can also be equally, or at least nearly equally efficient with CO2 emissions. Quite an optimistic message coming from this. Well, what we do, we are involved in worldwide harmonized emission test procedures, including the measurement of CO2 emissions. This is under preparation. But also, we are prepared to move equally strongly on fuel quality, which is, for you it's obvious, equally essential, equally important. Because of this, I particularly appreciate the Minister's expectations expressed in the declaration that the World Forum should accelerate its work on the development of environmentally friendly vehicles, hybrid, electric, hydrogen, and so on. This is the third and last slide I will show you. And the development of recommendations for market fuel quality, including biofuels. One thing that is important for me in this, on this slide is at the, well, in the middle, it's the third bullet point. We have discussed the issue of how vehicles, fuels should be built, produced, the issue of public transport, but also let's start thinking about mitigating the global warming impacts. If we are not going to prevent all the global warming, we should start thinking and translating this into action of how we are building infrastructure, transport infrastructure, to face the challenges of change climate. This should also be part of our work. The Global Harmonization Forum that we run in Geneva can also play a role in the discussions on the CO2 emissions levels. So all in all, we can become a big part of your, should I say, harmonization back office. You make the decisions and we'll provide a forum and the informed service to worldwide dialogue on these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to pick right up on your third bullet point on the last slide and talk about mitigation, because we have dwelt, in fact, on halting the progression of climate change, but we are inevitably going to see impacts. What exactly can your organization do in that area?
What you can do, what the ministers can do, what the countries can do. We can provide a neutral forum for you to meet and discuss. For example, issues of how road, rail infrastructure should be modified. Probably, and I am not an expert in transport, that is your task. But if global warming is inevitable, we should probably change the way how we build roads, transport hubs, ports maybe, all of this, not only vehicles. Because the wrong decision now will cost us dearly for 50 years. This is what we do. We are providing, we are facilitating solutions, not so much solving issues for you.
On this very impressive map that you showed us in the beginning, at least some parts of your membership have forged ahead with some of the policy tools that we've talked about, cap and trading schemes, target standards, and so on. To what extent does that prove a competitive disadvantage for those who break the ice?
Mm-hmm. It's the most important question of the whole thing. And my answer would be the following. Number one, if we are facing a really serious issue with potentially disastrous consequences for Earth, for everyone, then we have to be prepared not only for cost, but also for sacrifice. well, the sacrifice can be made in a smart way, collaborative way, or stupid way. Well, that is why we stress that this is a global problem, so global solutions must be thought for. But second remark, yes, I would not exclude sacrifice, which in your language, in the language of your question, is competitive disadvantage. But can we recall the discussions about environment protection 20, 25 years ago? It was obvious that it could have led to competitive disadvantages for those countries who are serious about it. Oh, we still are discussing about environmental dumping. What happened, on the contrary, is that those countries that became leaders in environment protection leapfrogged others in terms of technology and building modern society. Maybe this is another chance, another opportunity.
Competitive disadvantage as a market niche.
No. Challenge turned into opportunity.
On your map, of course, most of the green areas are in the industrialized north. To what extent do we need to hold rich countries to a different standard than poorer ones?
Oh my God, you are tormenting me with these questions. These are questions, every question is for another big conference or a serious conference. But a quick reaction to this is the following. We have to distinguish between standards and limits or targets. I think standards should be, in my opinion, universal. If we agree on vehicle efficiency, in my opinion, they should be introduced universally. Because if we sort of allow, if we are lenient, that, okay, in some parts of the world, vehicles can be less efficient. Of course, we can allow for some transitional periods and so on. But if we allow for different treatment in this respect, then we put these countries on a rather treacherous way into, which will last decades, if not forever. That will be very difficult to U-turn them from. Well, and there is the problem of targets, and they should be probably different, because this is a question of development. This is a question of also political international solidarity and political decisions. So we have to be careful about not mixing standards with targets. Standards, in my opinion, should be universal. Targets should be individualized, or maybe individualized.
Mark Becker, thank you very much.
Thank you. So should I sit down there,
please.
or?
You may take a seat here. Thank you. Mark Schuel, you're with the World Bank, so let's pick it right up there from that answer and ask, how do we bring these messages home to developing countries with burgeoning megacities, exponential energy growth, exponential growth in CO2 emissions, and rudimentary policy tools?
Well, Melinda, this is a very timely question indeed, because just a week ago, on May 21st, the bank launched its new transport business strategy 2008-2012, the title of which is Safe, Clean and Affordable Transport for Development. And clean, obviously, here addresses all the environmental impact of transport, one of the most important ones being indeed impact on CO2 emission and climate change. I must say this work will actually be complemented by a kind of implementation guidelines as far as transport and climate change are concerned in the developing country context. That's a document which will be probably issued during the first part of 2009. So indeed, this is one of the main strategic objectives. There are 5 of them which are spelled out here, and one of them is indeed to address the transport and climate change agenda in the developing country context.
Yesterday we heard the Norwegian minister mention the idea that we might have to sacrifice growth to meet the kind of aims that we're talking about. How do you want to sell that scenario to your borrowers?
I definitely don't want to sell this one. There is no question, in my view, and I believe that's the view of the World Bank, there is no question that fighting the climate change, let's say, or addressing the climate change agenda and continuing to support growth in the developing world must go hand in hand. It's no question, it's not one at the expense of the other. It's very important for the developing countries to get the support they need so that they can indeed do their part in addressing the climate change challenge without in any way hampering their growth prospects. And indeed, the support we'll be providing to them will be tailored according to their development stage. Timelines will likely be different, as Marek Belka just said. There will be targets, but there will be different timelines to reach them. But in no way we can consider that any reduction in growth could be acceptable to better fight climate change. Achieving growth is key to indeed achieving poverty reduction targets, and that's what we must keep in mind.
How concretely can the bank factor sustainability considerations into its lending? We've heard some talk about carrots and sticks. What do you have available there?
Well, the World Bank tended to be famous for its conditionalities. We actually try those days to be much more, I would say, pragmatic in conditionality. There are much less conditionalities in projects. We try to make sure that we don't in particular impose sector conditionalities in single investment loans which are very circumscribed to a particular investment. However, we do have development policy loans which are meant to help countries address sectoral issues, and then we may have some very targeted conditions. However, it's a question of mobilizing energies and convincing basically the policymaker that's the right way to go, rather than trying to impose on them a policy they won't really feel they own. So sustainability obviously is at the core of whatever the bank does. The bank reorganized itself 18 months ago, so that we do have now a sustainable development vice presidency which brings together all the various parts of infrastructure sectors, including transport, together with the environment and social development aspects. So that's at the core of the way we do business.
In transport or infrastructure lending, are there going to be some cities, for example, that you would consider simply too big at this point to be sustainable?
No, there are no lost causes for cities. Even if there are big cities today in the developing world, let's keep in mind that 90% of the population increase in the developing world in the decades ahead will take place in cities, which means that whatever size they are today, cities will continue to grow. And that actually provides an opportunity for using urban transport planning and public transport system design as a critical vehicle to help bring city development under control. More often than not, so far, urban transport has been kind of an afterthought when trying to plan city development. We do believe that it's a very powerful tool to actually bring city development under control, having a very upstream in the process, a very strong proactive urban transport design, including public transport services, that will make it possible also to have much more proactive land use management policies. And when you do that, when you have that in place, then you can actually provide for the supply of public transport. And when we do have a public transport service offer, then we can also design and implement traffic demand management policies which will be required to induce a lasting model shift. But there is one point I want to make here, because I believe it's important to keep in mind, especially in this audience. In the developed world, typically urban transport systems or public transport systems were meant to induce people to leave their cars, to go into the public transport system, mostly to alleviate congestion issues. And of course, the carbon emission challenge just strengthens this trend. In the developing world, however, providing public transport services first meant to provide access to transport for a part of the population in cities, mostly the most vulnerable part, who didn't have any in the first place. And we must keep this objective in mind. In the public transport system project the bank will finance, we do want to cater now to those two constituencies. Still provide access, because that is key to having a livable city and for equity purposes. And also now provide a public transport system which will make it possible the kind of model shift we are seeking. Now, of course, we are addressing two very different constituencies there. First, on one hand, people who already can afford a car with a certain ability to pay, and certainly clear demands as to the comfort and sophistication of the public transport system they might be willing to use. At the other end of the spectrum, the poorest part of the population who are desperate to get any transport service they can, provided it's reliable, with low ability to pay, and certainly much less demanding as to the sophistication of the system. So at first glance, it seems pretty difficult to reconcile those two objectives. However, if we think back this possibility now to factor in the planning of further urban development, those urban transport system and public transport system, we may get to a point where we'll get cities to develop in such a way that they will become more compact, that it will be possible to mobilize better non-motorized transport services, so as to reach a point where those cities will be more low-carbon cities overall, will still provide high level of mobility while being less transport intensive. And that's the way urban transport project will try to go towards. Actually, scaling up urban transport is another strategic priority in this document.
Thank you very much, Marc Juel, for widening our geographical focus.
You're welcome.
We do now have a short coffee break, just about 15 to 20 minutes, and then I'd like you to return promptly, if you would, please, because following that is our international stakeholders discussion, and we want to hear from many of you. So 11:05, 11:10, we will meet back here. Thank you very much.